So at my house, we have like 8 different methods of making coffee. Granted, like 5 of them are just different French presses. For a while, we were keeping them all on this one table, so I decided to draw them. There's a lot of ellipses, which I like drawing just because it's probably one of the more interesting ways to define a plane. And then there's also a lot of abstraction that happens when you have so many clear vessels. So there's like the 2 biggest things, or the 3 biggest things that you can probably identify on this table are the grinder, the water heater, and the like pour over rig. Yeah, we also use it to prep teas. It's like our little like breakfast bar. It's this square table that just sits in the middle of the kitchen. So I like sat by the windowsill and in back of the kitchen and just like tried to stay out of the way while I drew this. I think it was pretty quick. It involved a lot of measuring, like relative measuring, so trying to figure out where different contours began and ended by certain, like in relationship to certain elements or like landmarks. It's such a nice day out and there are so many clouds, so the room is just going to be constantly fluctuating. Like if you sped this up, it would be like we have like a power strip that's just like kind of coiled up hanging on the back that we plug like the grinder and the water heater into. We don't actually have like a normal coffee pot here, I don't think. We must have one somewhere. I haven't seen it in a while though. I think that's like a really old lime sitting on a cutting board in front of those 2 like mason jar-esque shapes. You can see through the kitchen to the other 2 rooms. We live in like a triple decker, so there's like the living room and then there's the dining area with like bay windows. I think in this you could only really make out the table, which is probably what I was like using those reference lines for, up in the upper left quarter. So there are those 2, like, that perpendicular shape. I think that's me using the table to measure against the water bottle. I think when you're looking at a drawing like this, there's a lot of information to take in. Even just making the drawing, I tend to be really careful about what bits of information I emphasize. So sometimes I'll be making choices, or I'll be recording information that doesn't really benefit like my visual understanding of what I'm looking at, but it does help me in terms of like the motor skill of drawing, or the motor familiarity with the space. So if you're always, anything you can record into your drawing is going to be pulled from what you're looking at least in perceptual art. Like every mark you can make, if you're looking at something, it will be relevant, even if it is quote unquote wrong. Some marks will have a higher value to your drawing. So like in this drawing, maybe there are certain areas of shading that maybe were higher value in the moment that I was drawing them, but now they kind of either flatten the image or they don't contribute enough that they'd be worth it. So maybe I could have gone into them with some whiteout. There's a certain relationship between maybe the lines in the water heater that are visible versus the shading that's through it. So those are 2 different media, and that contrast was a pretty high value choice in relationship to the drawing. Maybe the shading in the background, that is a high value choice just because it drastically changes the composition, even though it's probably one of the least technically rendered portions of the drawing. It's just a bunch of scribbles. But the choice made to darken that area as a whole drastically affected the way we visually understand this space. The line in the foreground, and then also probably the line of the coffee grinder's wire. The way I rendered them could be confusing, but the fact that they are like the definitive foreground plane, they like denote that space, is another high value decision. In order to like let you have that moment of spatial reasoning, the ellipses are absolutely crucial. So every ellipse has its own kind of like imaginary box over it. At least that's how you know what direction it will be like warped in. When you look at the tops of cylinders or the tops of anything, sphere, the side of a sphere, you are seeing it from your perspective. So they have to still sit on planes. And so there are a lot of imaginary relationships that we use while drawing. So I'm always using, so that we can think about it in terms of geometry. So thinking like really simple geometry. So we're thinking about lines, like segments that go forever, and we're thinking about planes. So quadrilaterals that recede. Having those tools, these like kind of basic geometric rules that you can follow, at least visually, you are able to draw almost anything in relationship to itself, which most of the time when we're drawing, I rely heavily on relative measurements and like seeing how things are related to each other in space. And like I will always encourage you to draw the entire environment. Don't just focus on a mug or a hot water boiler, and make sure that you see how it relates to everything around it, because then you will get the most accurate rendering or depiction of that object. With these imaginary kind of guides, these rulers that we have built into our spatial understanding of the world, seeing an ellipse like on the coffee grinder or on some of those rear mason jars, I imagine lines just grazing the outer limits of those ellipses. So you can have them in any direction really too, because they're always going to relate to your vanishing point. So you do need to have some understanding of where your eye level is in relationship to the object. So here I'm sitting pretty above, like my eye level is way outside of this this jarring. It's probably a few inches above, like if I had an extra set of paper. And I mean, that makes for an easy drawing. So keeping your eye level out of a drawing, it tends to help perspectively, because you don't have to change the way you're seeing something. So once you cross eye level, you're starting to deal with a distortion from what you had already been recording. So there's always distortion going on. So like right now I'm looking down at these objects, so they're all receding southbound, like downward, and I'm drawing them that one way. And then if I had included my eye level, the room outside of this room would have had to also deal with some distortion that's separate from that southbound distortion that happens with these coffee mugs or coffee products. So in this drawing, I had just gotten an isograph pen, like a Rotring isograph pen, and I wasn't able to get like pen ink for it, so I had this like fabric dye that I was using, and I just filled the pen with that. And I was like, this is thin enough that it won't clog the pen. And it was fine. It didn't hurt the pen at all. It's this brown color. So I wanted to make sure that I was using that brown color like as appropriately as possible. So I kind of kept it to this rule of I want it to signify a certain area in space, so a certain distance from me, about like 1.5 feet away. And I wanted it to act as this kind of unifying value range. So it only exists towards the table because that's where the shadows are at that range. By limiting the concept of your tool, like by limiting the function of your tool. So say you're painting or something and you were like, okay, I have this color. Or a better example would be, say you were drawing and you wanted to include paint. Instead of starting off immediately by including every color on the spectrum, what if you only included a gray or a blue? Then you are going to be dealing with a palette that responds to the drawing more than it responds to its conventional use. Which, if you're starting from a drawing, maybe that's the better way to develop going into a painting. Granted, this is coming from me, which is a somewhat biased narrative for painting. So because I'm much more interested in the record or the drawn mark or a certain stylistic tendency with paint. So then I just caution you. My roommate got me that pour over coffee rig for Christmas, and I've used it almost every day since. I think that was the very first day that I had used it at all. So it was cool to get to draw it. So I'm gonna go enjoy my day because it's way too warm out to be winter. But we should continue this again in a couple days because I will be doing it and you could be there watching it on your computer behind a screen. Do it. Yeah. Okay. Again, if you are interested in me talking about one of your drawings or communicating, let me know what you think. You can comment, you can message me directly, you can find me on Instagram, which will be linked below. I did make that hashtag last time. I haven't posted anything to it and no one else has, but we could use that still. But yeah, I hope to hear from you soon. Ending this like an email again. Okay. I hope you have just as nice of a day as I do.